The conference room smelled faintly of stale coffee and polished wood, a sterile scent that clung to the sleek modern office of Horizon Properties in downtown Chicago. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, glinting off the glass skyscrapers that loomed outside. At the head of the table sat Ethan Caldwell, 58, a man whose weathered hands and sharp eyes told a story of decades spent building something from nothing. For 20 years, Ethan had been the lead systems architect at Horizon, the backbone of a company that managed over 70 apartment complexes across Illinois, Ohio, and Michigan. He'd single-handedly crafted their digital infrastructure, every server, every line of code, every seamless process that kept tenants happy and cash flowing. Horizon wasn't just a company to Ethan. It was his legacy, etched into the circuits and databases he'd nurtured like a master craftsman. Across from him sat Nathan Brooks, 39, the newly minted Chief Technology Officer, his tailored suit and Ivy League smirk as out of place as a peacock in a steel mill. Nathan had been with Horizon for barely 8 months, brought in by the board to streamline operations after a private equity firm snapped up the company in a flashy rebrand. His designer watch gleamed under the fluorescent lights as he leaned back, tossing out the line that would change everything. "We can hire 3 junior engineers for your salary, Ethan," Nathan said, his voice dripping with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never gotten his hands dirty. "Nothing personal, just business. Cost-cutting's the name of the game." Ethan's jaw tightened, but his face remained a mask of calm. At 58, he'd seen enough corporate games to know how this one played out. The woman from HR, Sarah Mitchell, slid a manila folder across the table, her smile practiced and brittle. "The severance is fair," she said, her tone overly bright like she was selling a used car. 3 months' salary, plus your accrued vacation. We appreciate your years of service." Ethan opened the folder, scanned the numbers, and closed it with a slow nod. "That it?" he asked, his voice steady, betraying none of the storm brewing inside. Nathan leaned forward, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if he'd expected a fight, maybe even wanted one. "Most people have questions, Ethan, concerns, anything you want to say." Ethan met his gaze, his gray eyes unyielding. "Seems clear enough to me." He stood, his 6-foot frame casting a shadow over the table. Nathan and Sarah exchanged a glance, thrown off by his composure. They didn't get it. Ethan wasn't calm, he was done. There was a difference, one they'd learn soon enough. "We'd value your help with the transition," Nathan added quickly, recovering his swagger. "The new team could use some guidance on your systems. Maybe a short consulting gig?" "I'll think about it," Ethan said, knowing he wouldn't. He shook their hands, Nathan's grip weak, Sarah's hesitant, and walked out of the room, his boots echoing on the polished floor. 20 years of work, and it all fit into a single cardboard box, a framed photo of his wife Karen, a coffee mug from the company's 10th anniversary, and a stack of old notebooks filled with system diagrams no one else could decipher. In the parking garage, Ethan tossed the box into the bed of his weathered Ford F-150, the truck that had carried him through countless Midwest winters. His phone buzzed as he climbed in, a text from Jake Torres, the database admin he'd mentored for a decade. "Ethan, what the hell, they canned you? Team's freaking out." Ethan stared at the screen, then slipped the phone into his pocket without replying. He wasn't ready to talk, not yet. At home, in a modest brick house on the outskirts of Naperville, Ethan sat on his back porch, a glass of bourbon in hand. The sunset bled orange and pink across the horizon, reflecting off the small pond in his yard. Karen, his wife of 25 years, stepped outside, her dark hair streaked with silver. She rested a hand on his shoulder, her touch grounding him. "What now?" she asked softly. Ethan took a sip, the bourbon warm against the evening chill. "Something'll turn up," he said, his voice low but certain. He wasn't a man who dwelled on what-ifs. He built things, systems, solutions, futures. And he wasn't done building yet. What Nathan Brooks didn't know, what he hadn't bothered to learn in his 8 months of PowerPoint presentations and boardroom buzzwords, was that Ethan hadn't just built Horizon's systems. He'd woven himself into their DNA. Every piece of custom code, Every hidden redundancy, every security layer was a piece of Ethan's mind, crafted with a precision that only came from years of trial and error. The company had balked at his requests for a documentation team, too costly, they'd said, quarter after quarter. So Ethan had kept it all in his head, a living blueprint no one else could read, and he had no intention of handing over the keys. 2 weeks later, Ethan was in his home office, tweaking his resume on a laptop that hummed with the same reliability he'd built into Horizon's servers. The phone rang, the screen flashing Nathan Brooks. Ethan let it go to voicemail, his lips curling into a faint, humorless smile. Nathan's voice crackled through the speaker, tense and clipped. "Ethan, we're hitting some snags with the tenant portal. The new guys are struggling with your code structure. Can you call me back? Just a quick consult." Ethan deleted the message without a second thought. By noon, 2 more voicemails followed, each more urgent than the last. By evening, Jake texted again. "System's been down all day. Maintenance requests are piling up. Nathan's losing it." Ethan set the phone face down and poured himself a coffee. The next morning, Sarah from HR called, her tone syrupy with forced warmth. "Ethan, we'd love to discuss a consulting arrangement, temporary, of course, to iron out some system issues. The pay's generous, $350, 0 cents an hour, minimum 4-hour blocks." Ethan leaned back in his chair, staring out at the pond. "How generous we talking?" he asked, more curious than tempted. "Very," Sarah said, a hint of desperation creeping in. "Name your price." "I'll get back to you," Ethan said, hanging up before she could push further. He turned to Karen, who was slicing apples at the kitchen counter. "They're figuring out what I'm worth," he said, a wry edge to his voice. Karen raised an eyebrow, her smile knowing. Took them long enough. Over the next 3 days, the calls poured in. Nathan, Sarah, even a board member named Clara Voss, who'd once praised Ethan's work at a company gala. The tenant portal was offline, spitting out errors that baffled the junior engineers. The maintenance system crashed, leaving thousands of work orders in limbo. Worst of all, the payment processing system failed, sending incorrect charges to tenants and sparking a flood of complaints. Horizon's biggest client, Sterling Communities, which accounted for 35% of their revenue, was threatening to pull their contract. Ethan didn't answer a single call. Instead, he got an email that changed the game. It was from Apex Management, a scrappy competitor based in Indianapolis. The sender was Marcus Reed, their director of technology, a no-nonsense guy Ethan had met at a conference years ago. "Ethan, heard about your exit from Horizon. We've always respected what you've built. Interested in talking? We're looking to overhaul our systems, and we need someone who knows how to do it right." Ethan replied within the hour, setting up a meeting for the next day. That evening, as he and Karen grilled steaks in the backyard, the doorbell rang. Ethan opened it to find Nathan Brooks standing on his porch, his pristine suit rumpled, his face pale. "Ethan, I'm sorry to just show up," Nathan stammered, "but we're in deep trouble. The whole system's down, nothing works, the team can't figure it out." Ethan leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "Sounds rough." "It's a disaster," Nathan admitted, his voice cracking. "The board's authorized a consulting fee, $600. 0 cents an hour. Whatever you need. Please, Ethan." Ethan thought of the cardboard box in his garage, the 20 years he'd poured into Horizon reduced to a few keepsakes. He thought of Nathan's smirk, the casual, nothing personal. He thought of the documentation team he'd begged for year after year, only to be told it wasn't in the budget. "Sorry to hear about your problems," Ethan said, his voice quiet but firm, "but I've got an interview tomorrow. Something'll turn up." He closed the door, leaving Nathan stunned on the porch, and went back to his steak, the weight of the past lifting with every step. Ethan Caldwell drove through the pre-dawn streets of Indianapolis, the city's skyline a faint silhouette against the indigo sky. His old Ford F-150 rumbled along I-65, the hum of the engine a steady companion to the thoughts swirling in his mind. It had been 3 weeks since he'd shut the door on Nathan Brooks, leaving Horizon Properties to drown in the chaos of their own making. 3 weeks since he'd traded the weight of betrayal for the flicker of possibility. Today he was meeting Marcus Reed at Apex Management, a smaller but hungry competitor that saw in Ethan what Horizon had discarded, a man who built things to last. The Apex office was a modest brick building tucked in an industrial park, a far cry from Horizon's gleaming Chicago tower. Marcus greeted Ethan with a firm handshake and a grin that radiated respect. "I've been following your work for years, Ethan," Marcus said, leading him to a cluttered conference room stacked with servers and whiteboards. "That system you built at Horizon? It's the gold standard. We want you to do the same for us better, even." Ethan leaned back in his chair, studying Marcus. At 45, Marcus had the weathered look of someone who'd fought his way up from the trenches, not a boardroom. "What's the offer?" Ethan asked, his voice steady but laced with the caution of a man who'd been burned. "Chief Systems Architect," Marcus said without hesitation. "Full benefits, stock options, and a salary 25% higher than what Horizon paid you, plus a budget for a proper documentation team. No shortcuts. We want it done right." Ethan's chest tightened, not from the numbers, though they were generous, but from the promise of trust. For 20 years, he'd begged Horizon for resources to document his work, to train others, to build a system that wouldn't collapse under the weight of neglect. They'd called it unnecessary. Marcus was offering what Horizon never would: a chance to build something enduring, not just functional. "I'm in," Ethan said, extending his hand. For the first time in weeks, he felt the spark of purpose reignite. Apex was a whirlwind of ambition and grit. Ethan dove into the work with a ferocity that surprised even himself, designing a new property management system from the ground up. Unlike Horizon, where he'd been forced to patch together solutions with duct tape and ingenuity, Apex gave him the tools he needed. He hired 2 senior engineers and a documentation specialist, a young woman named Lila Chen, who turned his sprawling notes into clear, accessible manuals. Every evening, Ethan trained his team, not just on code, but on philosophy. Systems weren't just tech, they were promises to the people who relied on them. Karen noticed the change. Over dinner one night, she smiled across their kitchen table, her eyes soft. "You're alive again, Ethan. I haven't seen you this driven since we were kids." He reached for her hand, his throat tight. "I'm building something real, Karen. Something that'll outlast me." She squeezed his hand, and in that moment, Ethan knew he wasn't just rebuilding systems. He was rebuilding himself. But Horizon's collapse haunted the edges of his new life. Jake Torres, his old database admin, called one night, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "It's a mess, Ethan. The tenant portal's been down for weeks. Sterling's threatening to walk. Nathan's screaming at everyone, but the new guys can't crack your code." Jake paused, then added, "I'm done here. Half the IT crew's jumping ship." Ethan stared out at the pond in his backyard, the water glinting under the moonlight. "Come to Apex," he said. "We're hiring." A week later, Jake walked into the Indianapolis office, his laptop bag slung over his shoulder and a spark of relief in his eyes. Over coffee, he spilled the full extent of Horizon's implosion. Corrupted backups, furious tenants, and a board scrambling to salvage a sale that was slipping through their fingers. Sterling Communities, Horizon's biggest client, was on the verge of pulling their 12,000-unit portfolio. "They're finding out what happens when you gut the heart of a company," Jake said, his voice bitter. Ethan nodded, but inside, his heart ached. Not for Nathan or the executives, but for the tenants caught in the crossfire, the maintenance workers buried in unprocessed requests, the legacy he'd built now crumbling under the weight of greed. The turning point came faster than Ethan expected. 6 weeks into his role at Apex, Marcus burst into the server room, his face lit with a mix of excitement and disbelief. "Sterling just called," he said. "They're terminating their contract with Horizon next month. They want us to take their portfolio." Ethan froze, his hand still on a keyboard. "We're not ready," he said, his mind racing through the half-finished architecture he'd been crafting. "Our system's solid, but scaling to 12,000 units? That's a whole different beast." Marcus leaned against the wall, undeterred. "They're desperate, Ethan. Horizon's failures are tanking their reputation. They'll give us 10 weeks and fund the infrastructure. What do you need to make this work?" Ethan's pulse quickened. This was the moment, the kind that could make or break a company, a career, a legacy. He thought of the tenants who deserved better, the team he was training, the chance to prove Horizon wrong. 3 more engineers, dedicated servers, and a hard deadline for documentation, he said. No compromises. Done, Marcus said, clapping him on the shoulder. This is your show. That night, Ethan barely slept. He sat at his desk, sketching system diagrams under the glow of a desk lamp, mapping data migrations, stress testing every weak point. Karen found him there at 3 a.m., her robe wrapped tight against the chill. You're carrying too much, she said, her voice trembling. This isn't just about Apex, is it? Ethan looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. It's about everything, Karen. 20 years of my life went into Horizon. I built it for the tenants, the workers, the people who trusted me, and they threw it away like it was nothing. His voice broke, and for the first time since his termination, tears welled in his eyes. I can't let that happen again, not to Apex, not to Sterling. Karen knelt beside him, her hand on his cheek. You won't, she whispered. You're not just building systems, Ethan. You're building trust, and no one does that better than you. Her words cracked something open in him, a flood of grief and resolve that left him sobbing in her arms, the weight of betrayal finally spilling over. The next morning, Ethan presented his plan to Marcus, a modular system that could onboard Sterling's properties in phases, with every component documented and every engineer trained. This is how we avoid Horizon's mistakes, he said, his voice steady now, fueled by clarity. We build it to last. The weeks that followed were a blur of code, coffee, and late-night strategy sessions. Jake built a migration tool to translate Horizon's data into Apex's framework. Lila's documentation grew into a 200-page Bible that ensured no single person would ever be indispensable again. Ethan poured his heart into the work, driven by the faces he'd never meet. The single mom waiting for a maintenance fix, the retiree counting on a stable rent portal, the people Horizon had failed. Then came the bombshell. Marcus called Ethan into his office, where a man in a sharp suit waited, Daniel Hayes, CEO of Sterling Communities. We're not just signing with Apex, Daniel said, his voice grave. We're pushing to acquire Horizon. There are valuations in the gutter, and we think Apex can turn it around. But we need someone who knows both companies to lead the integration. Ethan's heart pounded. The irony was almost too much. Horizon, the company that had discarded him, now a broken shell that Apex might salvage. You want me to fix what they broke, he said, not a question. Exactly, Marcus said. But only if you're willing. And only if we do it your way. Ethan thought of the cardboard box in his garage, the years of loyalty repaid with a smirk and a severance check. He thought of the tenants, the workers, the systems he'd built, and he thought of Karen's words. You're building trust. I'll do it, he said, his voice thick with emotion. But no shortcuts. Full documentation, full training, every step done right. Marcus nodded, a slow smile spreading. That's why we hired you. As Ethan left the office, the weight of the challenge settled over him, but so did a fierce determination. Horizon had underestimated him, but Apex wouldn't. This was his chance. Not for revenge, but for redemption, for the people who deserved better, for the legacy he'd build anew. The road ahead was daunting, but Ethan Caldwell was no stranger to building from scratch, and this time, he'd make it unbreakable. The Indianapolis skyline glittered under a crisp autumn moon, its lights reflecting off the white river like a promise kept. Ethan Caldwell stood in the lobby of what was once Horizon Properties' Midwest headquarters, now rebranded as Apex Integrated Property Management. The sign above the entrance gleamed with quiet pride, a testament to the seismic shift that had unfolded in just 12 months. Ethan's boots echoed on the polished marble as he walked past familiar faces. Some who nodded with respect, others who looked away, still haunted by the chaos of the past. He wasn't here to gloat. He was here to finish what he'd started. A year ago, Ethan had been a man discarded. His 20 years of loyalty to Horizon reduced to a cardboard box and a smug nothing personal. Now, he was Apex's chief integration officer, the architect of a system that had not only saved Sterling Community's 12,000-unit portfolio, but had also swallowed Horizon whole. The acquisition had been a bloodbath. Horizon's valuation, once sky-high, had plummeted to a fraction of its worth, a casualty of their own hubris. Apex had swooped in, buying the wreckage for pennies on the dollar, and Ethan had been tasked with stitching the pieces into something whole, something better. The server room hummed behind a glass wall, its blinking lights a familiar symphony. Ethan paused, his reflection staring back from the glass. He could still see the ghost of his old self, the man who'd built Horizon's systems with sweat and ingenuity, only to watch them crumble under Nathan Brooks' reckless cost-cutting. But that man was gone. In his place stood someone new. Battle-scarred, yes, but unbreakable, fueled by a quiet fire that burned brighter than ever. The integration had been a grueling marathon. Ethan had worked 18-hour days, his team a mix of Apex's new blood and Horizon's shell-shocked survivors, including Jake Torres, who'd become his right hand. They'd migrated every property, every tenant record, every payment system to Ethan's new architecture, a modular, fully documented masterpiece that could scale without breaking. Lila Chen's documentation, now a 500-page tome, was the team's Bible, ensuring no single failure could bring them down. Ethan trained his engineers not just to code, but to think, to anticipate, to care about the people their systems served. The stakes had been crushing. Sterling's CEO Daniel Hayes had watched every move, his trust in Apex hinging on Ethan's ability to deliver. If they failed, Apex would lose Sterling's contract, and Horizon's collapse would drag them all under. But Ethan hadn't faltered. He'd thought of the tenants, families like the ones he and Karen had been, scraping by in small apartments, counting on systems to work. He'd thought of his team, their tired eyes and fierce loyalty. And he'd thought of Karen, whose belief in him had carried him through the darkest nights. The rollout had been flawless. Sterling's 12,000 units came online in phases, each region humming with precision. Tenants logged into a sleek new portal, maintenance requests flowed smoothly, and payments processed without a hitch. Sterling's board called it a miracle. Marcus Reed called it Ethan's triumph. Ethan called it his duty. But the real victory came in the quiet moments. One evening, as Ethan reviewed server logs, Jake burst into his office, his face alight. "Sterling's renewing for 5 years," he said, tossing a contract onto the desk, "and they're bringing 3 more clients with them. We're the biggest property management firm in the Midwest now, Ethan, because of you." Ethan leaned back, a rare smile breaking through. "Because of us," he corrected. But inside his heart swelled, not with pride, but with relief. He'd done it, not for revenge, not for glory, but for the people who'd been failed by Horizon's greed, for the legacy he'd refused to let die. The boardroom was packed, the air electric with anticipation. Marcus stood at the podium, his voice steady but charged. "Apex Integrated Property Management is now the largest firm in the Midwest," he announced, the room erupting in applause. "And we owe it to one man, Ethan Caldwell, our Chief Integration Officer." Ethan stood as the room turned to him, their cheers a roar that shook the walls. He nodded, his throat tight, and took the mic. "This isn't about me," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "It's about the tenants who deserve systems that work, the workers who keep them running, the team that poured their hearts into this." He paused, his eyes sweeping the room, landing on Jake, Lila, and the engineers who'd fought beside him. "We built something that lasts, and we'll keep building, because that's what we do." The applause thundered again, but Ethan's mind drifted to a memory. The night he'd sobbed in Karen's arms, broken by Horizon's betrayal. That pain had forged him, but it hadn't defined him. He'd chosen to build, not destroy, to prove his worth, not with words, but with results. Marcus approached as the crowd dispersed, his expression serious. "The board's approved your proposal," he said. "We're launching a technical education division next quarter. You'll lead it. Full autonomy to train the next generation of engineers. Teach them how to build things right." Ethan's breath caught. This was his condition for staying, the dream he'd carried since Horizon's fall, a legacy not just in code but in people, Thank you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. This means everything. No, Ethan, Marcus said, gripping his shoulder. Thank you. You didn't just save Apex, you changed how we think, about systems, about people, about what matters. Later that day, Ethan cleared out his integration office, packing files with the care of a man who knew their weight. A knock at the door startled him. It was Clara Voss, the former Horizon board member who'd stayed on as a consultant. Her silver hair was pulled back, her eyes heavy with something unspoken. Got a minute, she asked. They walked to the courtyard, the autumn leaves crunching underfoot. My father-in-law, George Voss, founded Horizon, she said, her voice soft. He's retired now, living in Florida, but he still asks about you. He said letting you go was the dumbest thing we ever did. She paused, her gaze distant. He was right. Ethan nodded, unsure how to respond. The anger he'd once felt had faded, replaced by a clarity that cut deeper. Value's hard to see until it's gone, he said quietly. Clara's eyes glistened. We lost more than systems when we lost you, Ethan. We lost trust. I'm sorry. For all of it. Her words hit like a punch, not because they hurt, but because they echoed the truth Ethan had lived. He'd spent a year proving that trust could be rebuilt, not with apologies, but with work. It's done, he said, his voice steady. We're building something better now. That evening, Ethan drove home along the White River, the leaves ablaze with red and gold, a mirror to the fire in his chest. Karen was waiting on the porch, her smile warm as she handed him a bourbon. Heard about the education division, she said, her eyes sparkling. You're going to change lives, Ethan. He pulled her close, the weight of the past year settling into something solid, something good. We already have, he said, his voice thick. They stood there, watching the sunset paint the sky, and Ethan felt it, a peace that wasn't triumph or revenge, but purpose. He hadn't needed to tear Horizon down. He'd built Apex up, brick by brick, system by system, person by person, and in doing so he'd shown the world what happens when you value experience, care, and the courage to do things right. The lesson wasn't his alone. It was for every tenant who'd been failed, every worker who'd been overlooked, every company that thought profit trumped people. Value, Ethan knew, wasn't just in systems or salaries. It was in the trust you built, the lives you touched, the legacy you left. And as the stars emerged over Indianapolis, Ethan Caldwell knew his legacy was just beginning.